everybody. Welcome to Fun and Money. This is a podcast about the economy, how it works, and how it can work better.
And today we have a special episode. We're going to call it a bonus episode because we're going to be talking to an actual congressperson, a member of Congress. This will be the first member of Congress we have on the show. Ro Khanna is going to be here today. Ka,
Yes.
Excited?
I like that you said an actual congressperson, as if we've had fraudulent impersonating congresspeople on before. It's an actual one this time.
What is unique about this episode is
He's
that
a real member of Congress.
besides him being a real life person, we've spent a lot of time on the podcast talking about things like monetary operations and fiscal systems and fiscal policy and the financial system, things like that. But on this episode, we're going to be looking at some of the actually a potential solution to the problems caused by private wealth and private money, right? Personal private money influencing politics in ways that are causing dysfunctional outcomes, if you will, right? And so that's kind of different from the whole system of understanding public money, but a critical issue nonetheless.
Yes, we're talking to Representative Ro Khanna, someone with the power to change things. He represents California's 17th Congressional District, the heart of Silicon Valley, and he went viral recently, actually for a good reason, because most members of Congress are going viral these days for being ridiculous on the floor of Congress. He introduced an anti-corruption and political reform plan.
The American people are frustrated and exhausted with the corruption and role of big money in the halls of Congress. That is why I'm introducing a 5-point plan. First, ban all PAC and lobbyist money to congressional campaigns. I don't take a dime of it. Second, ban completely stock trading and members of Congress from ever becoming lobbyists. Activists like Unusual Whales, Quiver Quantitative, and the leaders at Crew have been mobilizing for this. Third, term limits for members of Congress. Fourth, term limits for Supreme Court justices. And fifth, an ethics code for Supreme Court justices. This is common sense. The people demand it. It's time we give them back their government and we reform in Washington. We should have bipartisan support for this 5-point plan.
So we're really excited to talk to him. If you aren't familiar with Ro Khanna, he's a leading progressive voice in the House of Representatives. He's focusing a lot right now on restoring American manufacturing and technology leadership. He also focuses a lot on the climate and human rights and diplomacy around the world. And on the front of climate, he recently had the CEOs of 6 major fossil fuel companies come before Congress to testify under oath about climate disinformation for the first time in history. He's up to very cool things. He wants to work to improve the lives of working people. He was a co-chair on the Bernie Sanders campaign. The last time I was in a room with Representative Ro Khanna, we were launching Canvas in Iowa ahead of the 2020 caucuses there. So he's a cool guy with a background in economics, actually, which you wouldn't expect, but he was a professor at Stanford University, and we'll learn more about the very interesting background he has of why he got into politics in the first place later in the episode.
All right, Congressman. So when it comes to the regulation of corporations and business, the financial industry, budgeting, etc., how are decisions made in Congress, right? And how are they being influenced currently by members of Congress's self-interest in like holding stock or their own investments and lobbying that they're taking from some of these major industries out there?
Andrés, the biggest influence is campaign money. I mean, a lot of these corporations, health insurance companies, big oil, give money to members of Congress and then are able to influence the committee hearings or influence the bills. And then the second thing that happens is a lot of people, they work on the Hill, they're members of Congress or their staff, and then after they're done sitting on the relevant committees, they go work for the bank or the company which they're regulating. And then they know how to get the provisions that the companies want into legislation. And this is why people are just sick of the process. They know that it's not working.
So let's get into a little bit of the plan to fix this. Your, political reform blueprint includes banning PAC money, PAC donations, and lobbyist money. from being accepted by members of Congress. They're banning them from trading stocks, enacting term limits, and sort of closing that revolving door that we have. Can you talk a little bit about how this plan will address that problem?
Sure, Kai. There are 5 basic points to the plan. First, ban all PAC money and lobbyist money coming into Congress. I don't take a dime of it. Second, make sure that members of Congress can't trade stock. Ban that. Third, make sure members of Congress can't become lobbyists for their lives. You can't sit on the Armed Services Committee as I do, and then after you're done with Congress, say, oh, I want to go make $1 million by working at Raytheon or Lockheed and lobbying the Armed Services Committee. Fourth, have term limits. You shouldn't have people be there 30, 40 years. I mean, this is not an aristocracy, it's a democracy. And term limits for Supreme Court justices as well. And finally, a code of ethics for Supreme Court justices. Now, I've had everyone from Matt Gaetz to Ilhan Omar support the plan. So it's not a clearly partisan issue. It's an issue where people are saying we're tired of how things operate in Washington. We've seen working class and middle classes wages decline over the last 40 years. We've seen jobs go offshore. The American dream is slipping away. We get that big corporations and lobbyists have way too much influence, and we're sick of it. We want a new generation of people in Congress not beholden to these special interests. This is a start at getting at that problem.
So, Congressman, I know there's a number of bills out there that are trying to address this in different kinds of way. What is special or different about this one, and why should we kind of start thinking about the importance of getting this one ahead?
Andrés, this bill is a way of combining a lot of great efforts. I mean, there are good stock ban bills, which Abigail Spanberger and AOC and others have introduced. There are good bills on term limits. There are good bills that I've introduced on banning PAC money, on members not becoming lobbyists. But a lot of times they're disjointed efforts. And what I said is we've got to have one agenda, political reform, and here are the bills, and let's get these bills for a vote. And I think what struck a nerve, why it went viral, is people realize that these aren't just one-off issues. We've got to fix it collectively in reforming the institution of Congress.
And was there anything that inspired in particular your interest in this bill? Like as you've kind of gone through your career, what started getting your attention on this particular thing?
Well, I was one of the first people to say I will never take PAC money when I ran for Congress. And as soon as I got to Congress, started the No PAC Caucus. To me, money in politics, big money in politics, was corrupting and hurting the working class. But what inspired me to put this out right now is all of the shenanigans with the speaker. I mean, my view is that it's not that the American people want a new speaker, it's that they want new rules for Congress. They want a new approach to Congress. And so I thought, why not put this out now when everyone is discussing Congress, when everyone is discussing the dysfunction, and say, if you really want to solve it, it's not just getting rid of McCarthy, it's actually having systematic rules changes.
So this really does feel so common sense to me, and I think to a lot of people all across the country. As you said in your speech on the floor of Congress, this is common sense because people are sick of the corruption they're seeing in Congress. And I think it's really important that we understand this plan as an anti-corruption plan. There's so much partisanship and division in Congress. And I think everyone can agree that when a representative that's been elected to work for the people is making more money because of their relationship with lobbyists or corporate interests, and they're getting not only donations to their campaign, but then they'll get a really nice speaker fee if they go to this corporation. It's kind of like deal making. It's kind of like corruption. Can you just talk about how this has gotten bipartisan support from people like Matt Gaetz, which most people would say you and him are on opposite ends of the political spectrum. But I think there's more nuance to that. It's something that helps everyone in the working class when you have corporate interests not dominating Congress. Can you just talk about how this became such a bipartisan plan?
Look, I think it is such common sense, and it angers Americans that anyone will want to get up and represent them in Congress and want to do it for personal gain. Whether it's saying, okay, I want to go cash out afterwards and become a lobbyist and make millions of dollars or get speaking fees, or whether it's trading on stocks, or whether it is raising money from donors and then writing the legislation that the donors are interested in. It's just, there's a bipartisan anger. And so when I said what is obvious to most Americans, but not obvious in Washington, people took notice. And there are people on the Freedom Caucus, as well as the Progressive Caucus, who believe that this institution needs real reform, that it's no longer representing the people. Now, I have a strong disagreements with the Freedom Caucus. They want to cut spending. I want to make sure that we are supporting our working class and middle class. We have a philosophical difference, but where we have a common ground is that the current system isn't representing people. And that's why you have as diverse a group as Dean Phillips, Ilhan Omar, and Matt Gaetz supporting the plan. I mean, that's the political spectrum in many ways. And I believe that this actually will be very, very popular for members to sign on to. So I'm hoping we can build real support when we introduce it.
Whenever we talk about any sort of political issue on this show, because we're coming at it from a new perspective, we're always confronting the status quo, right? And a lot of beliefs that people have that are preconceived because of whatever the dominant narrative is in media or what have you. Obviously, corporations pay a lot of money for political advertising with a particular message. And so there's already some negative ideas out there about things like term limits. A lot of people believe that the primary itself should be the term limit. Let's start there and just talk about like why primaries haven't been sufficient in ensuring we have members of Congress that are really representative and accountable to the people.
That's a great question. It's because of money in politics and name ID. I mean, how do you take on an incumbent like me who's sitting on a war chest of millions of dollars and has universal name ID in my district? That's not a fair election for someone who wants to challenge me. And I say this honestly as an incumbent. So once you become an incumbent in Washington, given the rules of the way campaigns work, it becomes very hard to lose. And you're not really giving voters a real choice. The turnover rate in the United States Congress, according to The Economist, is less than the turnover rate of European monarchy families. I mean, it's crazy. And we call ourselves a democracy. So term limits will introduce new people into Congress. It will allow more women. It'll allow more people of color. It'll allow more younger folks who maybe can't raise $1 million or $2 million, which is now what it takes to be in Congress.
I want to go to a common question about the donations that are given to labor union PACs. Or donations rather coming from the labor union PACs to members of Congress. A lot of folks who want to, just criticize unions for any reason possible, criticize them from a direction of, well, their members don't always have a say in who they're endorsing, where the PAC money is going. But also growing political power for the working class. Unions have been a great vehicle for that. And I think that's necessary for us to have our politics move in the direction of having an economy and government that works for working people. So is this plan also going to ban labor union PAC donations from being received by people running for Congress?
Well, I'm a strong supporter of labor unions, and I am definitely believe that a lot of their money that they put in comes from working families. But what the bill does is ban all PAC contributions. It says we can't pick and choose, because if members of Congress start to pick and choose, you won't get bipartisan support for it. Let's just ban all of it. And working class labor unions can still have ways of collecting money, grassroots money, small dollar donations. Now, I know there are people who just want to ban corporate PAC money, and I understand that. I'm sympathetic to that view, but then you will not get bipartisan Republican independent support for it. So that's why my bill says ban all PAC money.
Another thing I've heard is that people are concerned that progressives already have to work a long time to get on important committees, to get on chairs, things like that. And so term limits might hurt that effort as well. What's kind of your response about that concern people might have about the time and the investment it takes progressives to get on these positions?
Well, the reason it takes so long is because of the seniority system. And right now, there are not that many progressives who are in those positions because they're being occupied by members who've been here 20, 30 years. If you actually had term limits for everyone, you would allow the next generation of progressives, Maxwell Frost, Delia Ramirez, AOC, Pramila Jayapal, to actually get a chairmanship much faster and to ascend much faster into significant influence. So now they have to wait 20 years. And, maybe AOC in 15 years is going to become chairman, but that's a long chairperson, but that's a long time to wait for her to get her ideas on the Green New Deal through a committee. With term limits, she'd be able to do that faster. And I believe that the new freshmen who are getting elected, they're closer to actually the concerns of people. They understand young people can't afford a house. They understand the issues of housing are so urgent, and the issues of student loan forgiveness and the issues of climate. And you have people here elected in the 80s and 90s, and they aren't as close to the people. And yet they're the ones who are in charge on the committees. And so term limits would make that balance of power shift more to younger folks, and folks are actually winning elections now.
And as a quick follow-up to that as well, another thing that I often hear is people pointing to the way things are and going like, look, this is being overblown. There's clearly limits to how much money can be put into the system, given to politicians, donated, etc. I'm interested in your take on some of the what we might call loopholes or interesting ways that things are designed for more money to come into the system than what might be there at first glance.
Well, every individual is restricted to give only $3,300 per election, and those are restrictions. But there are a couple of loopholes. One, if you're a multimillionaire, you can spend unlimited amount of money on yourself. I mean, how does that fare? Second, you have all of these super PACs, which are unlimited. So if you're a multimillionaire, you want to put in $1 million into a super PAC to get into an election, you can do that. Third, these PACs that can collect up to $10,000 very easily each. And a lot of times members of Congress will just have a breakfast in Washington, D.C., and they'll get $100,000 because they'll have all these PACs contributing to it. And then they end up being influenced by some of those PACs lobbyists. So it's not the Wild West where you have contribution limits for individuals, but there are all these other ways that big corporations, big money still have a major impact in our politics. And that's why, in my view, we don't have Medicare for all. That's why we don't have stronger negotiation on prescription drugs. That's why we don't have an end to fossil fuel subsidies and massive investment in clean energy. That's why we still are approving things like the Willow Project and pipelines for new fossil fuel infrastructure. So it's not just academic that, you got all this big money in politics. It's also actually impacting decision making.
So on this podcast, we talk a lot about public spending, how it works. We're in a time of a government shutdown being prevented from a stopgap bill. We keep running into this problem of a government shutdown and the government running out of money. Is there something or anything wrong in your view with how the majority of members of Congress view the U.S. government's fiscal situation?
Well, yes, there is. And at first, the members of Congress shouldn't be getting us into a potential shutdown every 2 months. I mean, we should have some automatic trigger for spending because it is very, very unhealthy for the United States government to not have some predictability. And it affects real people. I mean, there was someone who was working as a caseworker for me on immigration cases, and she's finally saved up to buy a new car. And she said, "Oh, I can't buy it right now." And I asked her why. She said, "Well, because I don't know when you guys are going to shut down and I'm not going to get paid." And these are people who are doing federal civil service. These are our troops. These are people at our airports. It's not fair to them the way Congress operates. But more broadly, obviously, Congress has the power to print money, to authorize the printing of money by the Treasury. And the challenges on deficits, which we have large ones, is it going to lead to higher interest rates and be inflationary? And we need to be mindful of that. But that's a power that Congress controls in terms of the amount of debt that we choose to incur.
It feels like a lot of members of Congress use this shutdown as a tool, right? You have a prior Congress that has passed a budget, then you have a new Congress come in where Republicans have a majority, and they want to relitigate everything that was already budgeted, or rather re-legislate everything that was already budgeted. And they use this tool of threatening a looming shutdown to kind of get what they want and pull on those purse strings. I think it's a really bad approach to politics. It feels really undemocratic. And it sounds to me like this plan that you've proposed will help with the budgeting process a bit and have a little bit more of what people might want to see reflected in the budget, actually in the budget. And they might be more reluctant to let us go to a shutdown so that they get what they want, which is usually a lot of austerity politics and changing our public spending in a direction where corporate interests really benefit, but the American people really lose out. Do you think this plan will help with the budgeting process and will help with public spending going more in the direction of having an economy and government that works for everyday working people rather than those corporate interests?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's going to get the corporate influence out, the lobbyists out, so we can actually be spending on things like getting people health care, like getting people education, like getting people childcare. I have a plan, childcare, $10 a day. Those are the priorities, should be the priorities of the Congress. But look, the Republicans are still going to object. I don't want to be Pollyannish. They're still going to say, even if there weren't corporate interests, that we're spending too much, that this is deficit spending. And our answer to them has to be, well, raise the taxes on the very wealthy. My district is $10 trillion of value. $10 trillion, 1/3 of the S&P 500, 30 companies in my district. And we've got more millionaires and billionaires than probably anywhere in humanity. Come tax them. Why can't we tax them? The guy from Silicon Valley is saying tax them so we can have healthcare, education, childcare, and make sure we don't have a $1 trillion defense budget. I mean, we don't need a $1 trillion defense budget to keep us safe, especially against climate, which is one of the biggest challenges of safety to the next generation and to Americans. So take tax wealth. Make sure you're repealing some of the Bush and Trump tax cuts, reduce some of the defense budget's massive spending that's going to defense contractors that's also being influenced by a lot of the corporate spending and influence in Congress, and then invest in what people want: healthcare, childcare, education.
Congressman, so here in New York City, where I'm currently living, at the local level, in elections, after a candidate gets a number of signatures or grows their campaign to a certain point, they'll start getting support from the city to be able to grow their campaign in terms of funds, right? And that brings in the really interesting question of publicly funded elections, right? Do you have any positions or feelings about things like this operating at the federal level, right? Like, I feel as if many progressive and independent campaigns and candidates could grow their chances of actually winning. I forget what the actual number is, but it's something like you have to have millions of dollars to have a chance at getting into any of these seats, right? If we had more publicly funded investment and a larger role for publicly funded elections, I think a lot of these problems would be solved. What's your position on publicly funded?
Absolutely agree with you. This is what Bernie Sanders showed with the grassroots spending. This is what AOC showed when how she raised money. But what I said is every voter should be a donor. I have a plan of a democracy dollars. Give every American $100 that they can give to different elections: city council, Congress, federal levels, Senate, president, state governors. And if you have $100 that you can spend, given by the federal government, then everyone will have to raise that money through individuals, and it would empower citizen-oriented campaigns. It's a proposal I have with Larry Lessig and Russ Feingold called Democracy Dollars. People can look it up. There have been pilot projects of that in Seattle and New York, where the government gives some matching funds once you reach a certain threshold. And that, I think, allows more people to be able to run from the working class, women, people of color, younger folks. Why is it that we have a Congress that is so skewed towards older folks, multimillionaires, non-working class folks? It's because it takes so much money to go into politics. Either you have to have it or you have to know people who have it. And so if you democratize that process, then you allow more representative voices. And then I've got to think that those voices will say, you know what, I know what it's like to have student loans. I do. I had $100,000 of student loans. I know what it's like not to be able to get health care. I know what it's like to not have childcare. And finally, you'd start to get policies more targeted towards them. We have a Congress that is out of touch with the needs of the American people.
As a follow-up as well, one of the other debates that's dominating the political conversation right now is inflation. On one side, as we've discussed, right, people are blaming, especially Republicans, are blaming the Biden administration and progressives for spending too much money during the pandemic recovery, even though we lowered things like child poverty by a really high percentage and did all these critically important things. On the other side, we're seeing the growth of a conversation around big corporations price gouging the public, around the importance of having strong supply chains that give working class people the health and the time and the protections needed to provide good work and keep our supply chains flowing. How do you see us continuing to fight this kind of one-sided, really narrow framing of things where any spending by the government is the one cause, the single cause of inflation and price issues?
Well, it's just not true for anyone who knows economics. So inflation is very simply too much money chasing too few goods, right? And so if you increase the money supply, if government spends more money and you're not increasing the denominator, the goods, then it is inflationary. But if you have money that's being spent productively to actually build new things, make new things, and you're increasing the productivity of a nation and you're increasing the denominator, then that is not inflationary. And a lot of the investments that we are making in building semiconductor manufacturing and bringing electric vehicle manufacturing, battery manufacturing, solar manufacturing actually is not inflationary. Some of the inflation was because of COVID. Some of the inflation is because of the war in Ukraine and the Saudi decisions to cut OPEC. Some of the inflation is because we're still exporting our oil instead of allowing that to be sent in the domestic market. And some of the inflation is because corporations are having record profits without having any regulation on what they're able to charge consumers. And we've not had a windfall oil profits tax. We've done nothing to regulate the big grocery stores that are charging too much. So there is a lot we can do to tackle the pocketbook issues for Americans. But this idea that just increasing government spending is inflationary is wrong. If that spending is productive spending, that's increasing the denominator of goods.
So I love that you started this off where, it's not true for anyone who knows economics. And I think there's a widespread concern that many members of Congress don't really know economics too well or fully understand how our fiscal policy should work, how our monetary system works. You have a background in economics. You taught economics in Stanford, and it sounds like you understand, how public spending should work much better than even most economists. There's an ongoing debate, and you don't have to answer this if it will get you into any trouble, but we always say, our members of Congress really, we say this dumb, but do they really not understand how this works? Or is it the case that they do understand how things work and they're kind of malevolent in the way that they go about their business? But do you think that many of your colleagues understand how the monetary system works, how public spending works, how economics works in these cases?
Obviously, the knowledge could be a little bit better, especially because there was this mantra of free market absolutism propagated by Reagan that just have tax cuts and somehow everything will be magically fixed. And people have bought into that, and that needs to be challenged. And there are not enough people in Congress challenging that. But to me, it's not that everyone has to go teach economics to go to Congress. I mean, that would be a very elite Congress. But I think people need to have the curiosity to bring in folks who really understand these issues, to bring in people like Robert Reich, to bring in people like Paul Krugman, others who who understand the basics and who understand that a politics that says let's just have tax cuts, let's just have austerity is not how we grew America. You look at FDR in the New Deal, and the unemployment rate during the Great Depression was around 25%. It falls to about 19% by 1938. But it goes to 5% in 1942. So what happens? Well, during World War II, we mobilized the private sector with massive government investment to set up new factories. That was massive government expenditure that ended up also creating a lot of production and was good for the economy and did not have nearly the inflationary impact that people thought. So I would just say we need to understand in America how we actually grew the economy in non-inflationary ways. And the key to that, in one word, if there was one word I would emphasize, is productivity, production. Government spending that's productive is non-inflationary and also pro-growth.
I love that you mentioned curiosity. I think that's been a common theme. We started off this season of our podcast with Stephanie Kelton on.
Of course.
And I think what we really understood that it's not so much this elitist perspective of you have to go to school and learn all of these things and learn how it works, right? I went to Brown for graduate school and found that it wasn't
What
a
did you
problem.
study?
I was studying public policy.
All right.
And found out the hard way that all of these people that have, in my thinking, have done all the calculations and have just figured out, what, it turns out we can't have nice things. Bad things will happen. But really, it became obvious to me because I grew up in a working class family that they're not even asking the right questions. It really isn't about, having the hard academic training with this stuff. It's about having the curiosity, and caring. So thanks for that. I really like that you answered with the word curiosity. I'm going to throw it to Andrés for the last question here.
Yeah, thanks, Colin. I really appreciate just in general.
Andrés, what did you study?
Oh, I'm currently in a PhD in public policy, trying to finish
terrific.
that up. But it's taken me a little longer because I got really committed to things like this and politics and
That's great. We're lucky to have both of your voices. And I do think that economics often can be a false science, and ultimately it's a question of values. And the reason we need to learn economics is to learn the jargon and language to push back against people who are cloaking values discussions in a cloak of expertise.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, the only reason I got interested in economics was because I was so upset about the orthodoxy, kind of saying things that I felt made no sense and were very disconnected from what we might call the real world or the way things actually operate. So I think there's a paradigm shift going on currently in how we think about the economy in all these different institutions, just like there's a paradigm shift happening even within Congress of people who are challenging the last 50 years of accepted dogma, right? But I'm curious, what inspired you, Congressman, to get into public service and run for office and dedicate so much of your career and your life to this?
Well, my interest in public service comes from my grandfather, Amarnath Vidyalankar. He spent years in jail with Gandhi in the Indian independence movement and spent 15 years fighting for India's independence and then saw India as a free country and was in the Indian parliament in the first one. And that gave me a sense that politics was such a noble calling. I mean, imagine someone could be part of the freedom of their entire nation and doing so with just and ethical principles that people like Gandhi articulated. And my first foray into politics in America was standing up against the Iraq War. I ran a primary campaign against a longtime incumbent in my own party who had supported the war in Iraq. I got crushed, but that was something that came to the notice of a lot of folks. And people said, yeah, we like this young guy standing for his principles. After I worked for President Obama, then I saw, representing the heart of Silicon Valley, that this was not sustainable, that you could not have so much economic concentration of wealth and hope and possibility in one place and have the rest of the country not participating or sharing, and having the working class not participating or sharing. And I said, I have a sense of what it's going to take to have the economic revitalization in this country, to bring the working and middle class into the prosperity of the 21st century. And that's been a lot of my work in Congress. So it was a sense that I could contribute from my life experiences and where I represented to actually making a difference in the lives of people. And I want people who are hearing this to take that experience maybe as hopeful, because I don't think people should opt out of politics. I don't think they should get too discouraged. I do believe people can still make a difference. And I hope some of the people listening will run for office and will participate.
I hope that as well. If you're out there listening, reach out to Andrés. I think we need people with this kind of view on the world, on politics, on the economy, running for public office. I think you should reach out to any of us here at Funny Money if you're thinking about running, because we have a background in organizing and politics as well.
And Congressman, I didn't know that background story. I found it really beautiful.
Me either.
So thank you for sharing that.
Thank you. Maybe you guys will run. Well, you have such a big platform already.
The ideas are there, but
let me know.
It's that big question always of whether you want to get into the spotlight or be behind the scenes, and I think we need both.
We definitely need both
in those areas.
We definitely need both.
Yeah.
Well, this was great. I think our listeners will really appreciate this episode. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, Kat. Thank you, Andrés.
Appreciate you, Congressman.
All right.
Yes. Okay. So now we're doing.
That was a great conversation with Ro Khanna.
That was lovely, and as we were mentioning in the private chat, I didn't know he had that background, and that was a beautiful story.
Yes, I think we both know a decent amount about members of Congress, especially the progressive ones. I had never heard that was what inspired him to get into Congress. That was so cool.
Yeah, I'm glad we got to get that question in there at the end.
And I was really surprised and satisfied with his answer to my question. I wasn't expecting...
Which one in particular?
When we asked about public spending, and we asked about if there's anything wrong with how members of Congress, typically the majority of members, view the fiscal situation of the United States. And he gave a response that I would expect from a lot of folks in the community of MMTers, right? This is a member of Congress who understands that members of Congress, he has the power of the purse, that they vote to create dollars, and the real constraint on spending is actually related to productivity. There's not going to be an inflation problem. Also, he said this in response to your question, that there's not going to be an inflation problem if you just spend dollars. There's a lot of factors there, including are there real things that those dollars can purchase once they're out in the economy? Are dollars being spent in a way that actually increases our productive capacity? Not just something that produces things, but increases our ability to be productive in the future. He really talked about real constraints.
Yeah, I think that was really helpful, because at least one of my goals in strengthening the discourse around something like inflation is to encourage people to think about the greater context of things happening. And a huge part of that is obviously what are we actually doing with the money that we spend, instead of this knee-jerk reaction of too much money is bad, is inflation, Weimar Germany, right? So that was great to hear that from a member of Congress, to directly speak about, are we increasing productive capacity or not? And how critical that is as well. Also, just in general, really great to talk about hey, we should do something about all this private money influencing politics and corrupting our entire system. I didn't know the anecdote about people in Congress outliving monarchies. That was kind of neat.
Yeah, about the term limits.
Yeah.
Yeah, I also really just appreciate that we now have something to say when we get the common question of, well, if these ideas are so good and we have to change so much stuff about how the government works, why aren't they just doing it? If they could just, authorize public spending to make people's lives better, wouldn't they just do that? And there's real reasons why they don't. And a lot of them are paid not to govern in a way that helps people. They're paid not to have an economy that functions for everybody. They're taking money from big corporate interests. And I think it's true that when you're getting that much money from corporate interests, that's a lot more than your congressional salary. You work for them now.
Yeah, the issue is just this has all been normalized, and it's just the way things are flowing and happening on a regular basis, and we need to kind of legislate our way out of it, because our institutions have just been designed at this point to depend and rely on private wealth and private money in order to do that. And so if we're on this podcast, we're always advocating for the importance of public money, how we should be using public money for more things, and how at the end of the day, the system is inherently public, right? Well, a big thing stopping our understanding of that and our use of public money is the role of private money in politics. And so, yeah, that's going to be critical. Now, I can also imagine, though, people, some kind of activists in the MMT, modern monetary theory community, kind of feeling a little anxiety about the precision of some of the answers in this question, on the questions we asked. And so I think it could be helpful also to just speak to some of those things. The first one that comes to my mind is, right, there was a moment there where we talked a little bit, or Congressman Khanna discussed taxing the rich as, the best response to Republicans that say the deficit's going to get too big or we're spending too much money. So, what was your initial reaction to that, Ka?
Well, the question I asked was, what do you think is going to change when this bill is passed for how members of Congress handle public spending, government shutdowns, et cetera? And I think he's probably right that most members of Congress who are not thinking about the big picture, so his previous response about the real constraints to public spending, I think a lot of members of Congress are going to want to raise tax revenue in order to fund a lot of public spending. And I think the first approach that members of Congress will take is probably, wealth tax and reducing defense spending. If they're not able to take money from Lockheed Martin Corporation, if they're not able to make money from the sectors that they're currently kind of beefing up more with the power they have to create the public budget, if they're not able to do that, I do think that's an accurate assessment of what will change. What we would like to see happen probably is, yes, we want a wealth tax because that's too much power for wealthy people to have in our society. There's no reason for them to be hoarding dollars and dollars and have all of that capital. But I think what we would like to see is for them to just authorize public spending in the direction of what industries do we need to increase productive capacity in? How do we make our workforce whole? How do we make people whole with things like universal healthcare, which was mentioned? And so that's what I think, hopefully his vision is, but I can understand why he gave that answer based on how the question was asked.
Yeah, it speaks to the larger issue of thinking about strategy to decouple taxing the rich or decreasing the military budget, because those are things we should do for their own reasons, versus doing that so we can raise revenue or lower the deficit or whatever. And there's got to be different strategic ways to think about the best way of going about doing that. One of the problems that we might put ourselves into, like we might pin ourselves against a wall if the only way we're arguing that we can finance something really important is if we are able to raise revenue in some way or another. And that, just might put us in a really bad political situation, not only to win that legislative battle, but then to sustain it afterwards if we want to keep these programs going and we already legitimize them only on the fact that we raised the revenue for it. And so I think for all of our listeners and viewers, just thinking about that in particular, right? Like the importance of decoupling, raising taxes on the rich or lowering the military budget because, we want less war and because rich people have too much power from their wealth, from relying on that to fund things. That's the key thing there.
Yeah. And I think our listeners should just be happy that we have another member of Congress who understands the real constraints to public spending that confirmed on this episode. The answer he gave there was a really good one. And I don't credit it to his background in economics. I credit it to what he said around curiosity. And I think the more people look into how things work and what the patterns are in terms of, fiscal stimulus, which was something he referenced there, how we handle our economy, when you study the patterns of the booms and the busts and what gets us out of times of an economic downturn, where the economic stimulus was, what worked and what didn't, if you're curious enough to look into it, eventually you arrive at these conclusions that we've arrived at, and a lot of our guests that we have on have arrived at. All of them, not necessarily academics.
Right. And it speaks to a really important piece on what people into economics and policy do in terms of their contribution to politics and things in Congress and passing legislation, which is like working to reshape the framing of things and how important that is. And even having someone like Ro Khanna talk about the real constraints as opposed to just, fixating on the debt and the deficit, and even uttering those words, what are the real constraints? Like, that is a huge W for us that we need to continue to contribute to and expand and work on to improve the quality of our debates about policy in this country.
Yeah, it's really a W for everyone. And I think members of Congress, just anyone, gets flamed for not talking about the debt and public spending in the context of treating the economy and public spending like we have a household. The U.S. government, the federal government, is a household. Anyone who strays away from that framework, which it hasn't happened, really. I shouldn't even say that. But there's an assumption that you'll have to have an influx of arguments that you must grapple with, of people saying, how can you let our government take a credit card out with the Bank of China and our children will inherit all of that? It doesn't need to happen because
that's a lost cause. That's a lost cause. Yeah.
Yeah. We're right. So we should just say it how it is. And he did that.
Absolutely. The other thing that I think is important is, and that still needs more work, quite frankly. I think that in the world of policymaking and how people in elected office legitimize their positions and bring people in to contribute to what they do depends a lot on like certain figures, oftentimes economists, that kind of sit in positions of a lot of authority, right? And currently, in terms of the Democratic Party, Paul Krugman and Robert Reich, who were mentioned, they occupy a very heavy and influential role. I'm personally a little bit more sympathetic to Robert Reich than I am to Paul Krugman, but I do think that we have a lot of work to continue to do to move beyond them, quite frankly, as figures that provide a lot of legitimacy for the kind of objectives that we want, to be more ambitious and bring in more heterodox, innovative figures that will simultaneously, I think, pressure Paul Krugman and Robert Reich to expand on what they say and shift some of their discourse. Because, for me personally, too many of their ideas are orthodox. Too many of their ideas are caught up in the mainstream, and they will kind of have that knee-jerk reaction often to seeking revenue to pay for things and to worrying about the deficit and the debt when they don't have to. Playing those games that Republicans and the right, or the legacy of Ronald Reagan, have set up for us as a trap, and this is where it's important, I think, to emphasize figures like Stephanie Kelton and Pavlina Cherneva and Randy Ray and others much more.
Yeah, I think when I imagine, Robert Reich, Paul Krugman, it's like I agree with some things they say. Krugman, I'm always like, good premise. Oh, wrong conclusion, And I think that there are so many people that I would not agree with at all, like Milton Friedman, right? Like there are so many people who are just so much more neoliberal than them. And it's like a step in the right direction. But I think when I would consider who my heroes are, it's the people you named. And I think that what's good about Robert Reich, especially, is the intentions are there and the curiosity is there. And these are people who seemingly care about what the economy is like for working class people. But I think that they are steps in the direction of us, and probably necessary steps when we think about people's minds changing. But
yeah. And we actually
get curious and maybe listen to this podcast, and maybe one day Krugman will be espousing our views.
Well, here's the thing. Maybe Krugman found himself in the cube. And if you don't know what the cube is, watch our first episode. But to situate some of I think like the discontent with what Paul Krugman and Robert Reich ultimately conclude, we have in our episode with Randy Ray, our interview with Professor Randall Ray, he talks about how the followers of Keynes split into two different sides, and some of those are called neo-Keynesians or new Keynesians, and then another branch of those are called post-Keynesians. And so when oftentimes we identify Robert Reich or Paul Krugman or others like them as like Keynesians, what we're really talking about is the branch of those who follow some of the things that Keynes taught that got internalized or integrated into the mainstream or the orthodoxy of neoclassical economics. And that's why, some of the premises they have make some sense, but ultimately it gets all kind of hazy and confusing and just it seems like it's at the end of the day limited by some of the mainstream ideas that we find so problematic. And that's where that tension is, right? And some of it is just because like to be successful in the field of economics, you have to adopt those views because that's how like so many of our universities teach it.
I think there's also something at play here, which we mentioned earlier when we were talking to Representative Ro Khanna, and it's that he understands fiscal and monetary policy and the monetary system in a way that many economists don't. And I think it's important to also mention that how public spending works and how the monetary system works, unfortunately, not something that's taught in economics programs. And you have people like Krugman, who focuses a lot on inequality and wealth. And you have someone like Robert Reich, who focuses a lot on labor. You have economists who probably haven't spent much time thinking on the monetary system and how it works. And that's really what we focus on in this show. And I think we care about it so much, and we care about having people that get it and get how public spending works, because it's the key to changing our economy and setting our government and society up in a way that is just, where people have what they need. It's literally a blueprint to some degree for economic thinking, for how to make public policy that works, for how to set up an economic system that works. So when we think of economists, we're kind of like, well, why don't they get it? And I think a lot of economists just don't focus on it. And so you might think, well, I trust what Krugman says about wealth inequality. I trust what Robert Reich says about how the labor market should work. So I should trust what they say about public spending as well. And I think this podcast is kind of that missing puzzle piece of like, actually, no. And this is how it works. And these are people who get that. And this is where you can get that piece. Yeah,
absolutely. If it, a lot of Stephanie Kelton's anecdotes are about how they just don't touch the money question in higher education and in economics. They're not interested in it. A lot of people feel like they can't advance their careers if they research or talk about money. It's like a taboo issue. And so the consequences are that like, even if oftentimes economists have the right values, or they want to talk about things that we might share our principles on, when it comes to literally one of the most important things, which is like the financial system and money and investment, you might go down some problematic tracks. And so, yeah, that's I think you're exactly on point there in that this podcast is trying to add that missing puzzle piece to budgets, money, financial systems, that macro part of the economy, to the larger question of inequality and progressive programs that will guarantee rights that we don't have, economic rights that we don't have, economic stability, overcoming the climate crisis that we don't have, and overcoming the climate crisis, which ultimately is premised on a social crisis, and all of these things that, we're just not going to be able to resolve if we are still imprisoned in the narrow confines of, you have to raise revenue to pay for anything. The deficit is inherently bad. The national debt's going to bankrupt us. These things have so much power over.
This economy is a prison.
This economy is a prison.
Yes. I was a really good conversation with our friend in Congress, Ro Khanna, and we meant what we said. If any of you are thinking about running for office, he's right that we need people who understand this in public office. And I only said reach out to Andrés, not because I didn't want to talk to you, but because Andrés played a pivotal role in someone actually getting elected to Congress the campaigns that I worked on, the Bernie Sanders, we lost, you know? It's not because of me, hopefully. Maybe it's all my fault, actually, that Bernie lost in 2020. I was just a field organizer. No, and a regional organizer after that. I was in the grassroots side. But Andrés and I will help you, talk to you, give you some connections if you want to run for office.
Absolutely. Yes. And the last thing I'll say is just like, I find it really awesome that we're connecting our interests in macroeconomic policy and money with like, hey, let's get private money out of politics, out of their influence on politicians. And I think Ro Khanna did an amazing job of bringing that to the table. And let's work to get that bill more popular so it can be passed.
Talk to your friends and family, call your representatives.
And call me up.
And call Andrés. And send Mike pie. Thanks for listening to another episode of Funny Money. We love you guys so much. Make sure you like, share, and subscribe to the podcast so that more people hear it. It comes up on the algorithm or something.
Peace.
Richard Nixon. How did you do that?
I don't know.
It just did it when you went like that? Why does he get all the cool stuff? All right. Thanks for listening, everyone. Woo!